She had 47 cents, a dead man's journal, and a pair of boots that should have retired 3 years ago. Harlan Voss threw everything her father owned into the mud that Tuesday morning, right there on Main Street, in front of the whole town, and not one single person stepped off the boardwalk to help her. So Clara Rose Hadley got down on her knees in that mud and picked up every last piece with her bare hands. Not because she was not broken, she was. But sitting down meant agreeing with every word they had ever said about her. And she was done agreeing. So she stood up, and she walked. 7 miles in August heat, through dust and rock and a sun that had no mercy. Toward a gate she had never seen, toward a man she had never met, toward the only thing she had left, a chance. What happened next changed everything, and I promise you, you are not going to see it coming. This channel is home to stories of the American West. Stories about love that grows slow and runs deep. About the courage it takes to start over with nothing. About the bond between a parent and a child that outlasts even death. About ordinary people who find extraordinary strength in each other when the world gives them every reason to give up. If that is the kind of story that speaks to you, you are exactly where you belong. Clara Rose Hadley teaches us something that most of us spend our whole lives learning. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is something you carry inside yourself, and no one can take it unless you let them. She walked 7 miles with 47 cents and came out the other side with everything that actually mattered. The lesson is this: the hardest road is sometimes the right road, and the only way to know is to walk it. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button right now and leave a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Share this with one person who needs to hear it today. And if you are new here, subscribe and ring that bell. A new story is waiting for you every week. Stay with me. You are going to want to see where this road leads.
Harlan Voss threw my father's things into the mud at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and not one person on Main Street took a single step off the boardwalk. I watched it happen from the middle of the road. His men came out of the house that had been my father's house for 22 years, and they carried his things the way you carry garbage. The rocking chair he built with his own hands, the tin box where he kept his seeds, the leather journal he wrote in every night by lamplight until the night he couldn't anymore. The journal hit the mud first. I walked forward, got down on my knees in the August mud in front of the whole town of Copper Falls, Colorado, and I picked up every single piece with my bare hands. Nobody moved. Harlan Voss stood on the porch step in a good suit and watched me with the patient satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular Tuesday. He was 58 years old, and he had the comfortable, smooth face of a man who had not been seriously contradicted in years. He watched me kneel in the mud, and he said nothing, because he did not need to say anything. The watching was the statement. I am 34 years old. I am a large woman. I have been a large woman my entire life, and I have spent most of those years being reminded of it by people who believed the reminding was some kind of service to me. I have broad shoulders and heavy hips, and a face that is a good face by any honest accounting, gone red from the heat and the effort of kneeling in the mud on a Tuesday in August. I picked up the journal first, pressed it against my chest before I picked up anything else. Then I stood up. I did not cry. I wanted to be clear about that. I had 47 cents in my pocket, a canvas bag with 3 days of food in it, boots that had been resoled twice and had no third resoling left in them, and the last hard edge of a refusal to agree with anyone who had ever told me I was too much and not enough at the same time. I looked at the crowd on the boardwalk. I looked at Harlan Voss on the step. Then I turned and walked away from the house that was no longer mine. And I did not look back. My father was Thomas Hadley. He ran 40 acres on the east side of Harker Creek for 22 years. He was a careful man, a methodical man, a man who wrote down every figure in that leather journal and checked it twice, because he understood that the written record was the only thing standing between a working man and a man with better lawyers. He borrowed money from Harlan Voss 14 years ago during the drought years, when the choice was borrow or watch everything die anyway. He paid it back every season, every harvest, never missed a payment. And yet Voss's ledger always showed a small discrepancy. Never large enough to act on. Never small enough to resolve cleanly. My father died in April. Voss came in May. 30 days after we buried him, a lawyer from Denver showed up with a document that said the debt was technically, legally, still outstanding. The figure had been adjusted, I was certain of it. I had no way to prove it. Not yet. I had 47 cents, my father's journal, and 7 miles of road between me and the only lead I had. An old woman named Fern Grady, who had kept house for the Calloway family before her knees gave out, had mentioned to my neighbor the month before that Everett Calloway out at Calloway Ridge needed a cook. Said he was a fair man, a hard man to work for, and that his kitchen had been through 3 women since March without any of them staying past 3 weeks. I did not ask for more information than that. I took the road west out of Copper Falls at 8 in the morning, and I walked. The road was dust and rock and the particular cruelty of a Colorado August that pressed down on everything living and dared it to keep moving. I kept moving. I stopped once at the 4-mile mark, when my boots started telling me very clearly what they thought of the whole enterprise. I sat on a fence post and opened the journal to the last page my father wrote. It said this: Rose, if you are reading this page, it means I am not there to say it out loud, so I will say it here. You were never too much. You were always exactly enough. The road will be long. Walk it anyway. You never were a woman who quit. I closed the journal. I stood up. I walked 3 more miles. Calloway Ridge came into view over the last rise at just past 10 in the morning. It was larger than I expected. The barn, the house, the outbuildings, the particular industry of a working ranch in late summer. Men moving in the distance, the smell of horses and hay and wood smoke even in the August heat. A single letter was burned into the crossbar of the gate. I stopped under it, looked at what I was walking into, set my jaw, walked through. The first man I encountered was sitting on a fence rail with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has watched enough horizons to know that nothing good comes over one without some trouble attached. He was maybe 55, weathered down to the essentials, with eyes that moved over me with the professional assessment of a man who has spent a lifetime judging things for their usefulness. I said, "I'm looking for Everett Calloway. I heard he needs a cook." The man on the fence did not answer. He looked at my bag. He looked at my boots. He did the arithmetic of how far a woman my size had walked in August heat to get to this fence. Then he turned toward the barn and called one word. "Boss?" Everett Calloway came out of the barn at a measured pace, tall, dark-eyed, the kind of face that has been set in one expression long enough that it has become the default. Not cold exactly, settled. Like a man who decided a long time ago what he was going to be and has been it every single day since. He stopped 10 feet from me, looked at my face. Not my body. My face. I noticed that immediately. The absence of the look I had been bracing for my entire adult life. He simply looked at my face, the way you look at someone you're trying to know. I said, "My name is Clara Rose Hadley. My father was Thomas Hadley. He ran the property on the east side of Harker Creek for 22 years. He passed in April. I am looking for work. I heard you need a cook." Everett Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have had 6 people come through that gate since March. 5 of them turned around before I finished the 3rd question." I said, "Then ask me the 3rd question." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. The place where a smile would live on a man who smiled more freely. He said, "Kitchen is inside. Show me what you can do." I had 40 minutes and a pantry that had been organized by practicality without any real system. I made biscuits because biscuits tell you everything about a cook, whether they understand fat and flour, whether they have the patience to not overwork the dough, whether they know the oven has to be right before a single biscuit goes in. I made pan beans with salt pork and dried sage. I made a gravy I had been making since I was 8 years old. When I set the plate on the table, my hands were trembling slightly. I noticed it. Everett Calloway noticed it. Neither of us said anything about it. He ate. The kitchen was quiet. Then he said, "Pay is fair. Room at the back of the house, small but private. 3 meals a day. Sundays you decide what that looks like. Men clean up after themselves. That is a house rule, and they know it." I said, "One thing. I will not be spoken to in a way that does not suit working people. If that is something your crew does, I need to know now." He looked at me steadily. He said, "Anybody on this crew speaks to you wrong, they answer to me. That is how this ranch has run for 20 years. It is not a special arrangement." I reached across the table and offered my hand. He shook it, full grip, the kind of handshake that says I see you as a person worth the full force of one. I said, "When do I start?" He said, "You already did. Those are the best biscuits this kitchen has had in 5 years." That first night, I lay in my small room with the window facing west toward the mountains, and I held my father's journal, and I listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds. Horses shifting in the barn, wind through the grass, something distant and wild. I thought, I do not know if this is where I belong. I only know that I walked 7 miles and nobody threw me back out. Tonight, that has to be enough. I was up before the ranch every morning, not because anyone asked me to be, because the dark hours before the world remembered it had work to do belonged entirely to me, and I'd learned years ago to guard that kind of time carefully. I got the big iron range going and stood in the quiet kitchen with my first cup of coffee and took inventory. Good stove. Best stove I had worked at in years. Deep pantry with good bones, and 4 years of a kitchen that had been passed through instead of inhabited. The difference is visible if you know what to look for. A kitchen that is inhabited has its own order. Things where they belong because the person who belongs there put them there. A kitchen that is passed through has things where they ended up. I began quietly and without announcement to inhabit it. The crew filed in for that first breakfast all at once, the way a crew does when word has traveled faster than any individual man will admit. 6 men and a boy, filling the kitchen with noise and the smell of outdoor work. They stopped when they saw me. I kept my back to them a moment, finishing at the stove. I felt the stillness happen behind me the way I had always felt the stillness of rooms when I entered them. The recalibration, the assessment. I turned around. I looked at each of them in turn, unhurried and steady. 6 strangers and a boy who was trying very hard to look older than he was. I said, "Clara Rose Hadley, I start today. Sit down before the gravy cools." The biggest man, red beard threaded with gray, pulled out a chair immediately. He said, "Yes, ma'am." The way he said it settled something in the room. His name was Big Sam Hooper. He was from Texas originally and had been at Callaway Ridge for 6 years, and had the wide, honest face of a man who finds the world generally agreeable and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. The quiet one with the watchful eyes was Dutch Reeves. He had been everywhere and said nothing about any of it. Frank Ogle was the one who watched me with the specific expression of a man who has decided to be skeptical before he has enough information to be skeptical about. Not hostile, just careful. It would take him longer than most to change his mind. He would change it completely when he did. Nate Sellers was 22 and homesick in the way young men are when they do not yet know how to say so. He wrote letters that I would later find out he never sent. And Kit Dalton was 17 and barely that, eating like he had somewhere urgent to be, going red at the ears every time I looked in his direction. I caught Kit in the kitchen late that first evening, hand in the biscuit basket, eyes wide. I did not scold him. I pushed the basket toward him and sat across the table. He said very quietly, "My mother makes biscuits like this." I said, "Where is your mother?" He said, "Kansas. I have not been home in 2 years." He stared at the table. I did not offer advice. I did not offer comfort. I just listened. I have found that listening is the rarest thing a person can offer. Most people hear you talking and spend the time assembling their response. Listening means you let the other person finish, and you sit with what they said before you decide what it deserves. I sat with what Kit said. After a while, he looked up and seemed embarrassed and started to go. I said, "Come back to the kitchen if you need something. The door is not locked." He nodded and went out. I looked at the window and saw the shadow of a man who had stopped in the doorway and then moved on. The shadow was Everett Calloway's. I could tell by the height and the stillness of it. He had seen me listen to the boy, and had not come in, and had walked away quietly. I filed that away in the part of me that was still figuring out what was true about this place. Roy Tanner found me alone the second morning. Roy was the foreman, 55 years old, weathered to the essentials of himself, generous with loyalty and spare with everything else. He had been at Callaway Ridge for 11 years. He was the moral weight of the crew without holding any official authority, the way certain people become the gravity of a room, simply by being consistently themselves. He said, 3 women before you. First one could not stand the cold. Second was afraid of the horses. Third one left on the 14th night without telling anyone. I said, why did the third one leave? Roy's jaw tightened. He said, a man came by twice while she was here, said things. She did not say anything back. I said, what man? Roy said, his name is Harlan Voss. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. I said, Voss knows I am here. Roy looked at me steadily. He said, Copper Falls is not a large town, Miss Hadley. He walked away. I stood with a dish towel in my hands and understood something I had not fully considered when I set out on that 7-mile road. I had not walked far enough to outrun this. Jesse Callaway arrived the third evening. He came in late, dusty, with the easy grin of a man accustomed to being forgiven before he has asked for it. He was 28, Everett's younger brother, with Everett's jaw and none of Everett's stillness. I saw him and Everett exchange words in the yard that I could see through the window but could not hear. Brief, tense, the kind of conversation 2 people have when they have been having it for years and neither of them has moved. Jesse caught me watching. He turned the grin on me like a weapon. He said, you are the new cook. How long are you planning to stay? I said, long as the work lasts. He said, that is what the last one said. I said, I am not the last one. He looked at me a moment. Something flickered behind the easy grin, there and gone. He said, no, you are not. He turned to go. Something fell from his jacket pocket, a folded paper with a wax seal. He scooped it up fast, but not before I read the letterhead. Voss Land and Banking. Pueblo, Colorado. I said nothing. I went back to the kitchen and made supper and thought about what that paper meant and what it did not yet prove. That same evening, I read my father's journal. Not for grief this time, for information. I found this entry dated 3 years before he died. Voss does not want the money back. He never wanted the money. He wants what water does to land value in a dry county. He will find the year-round source and he will build everything else around it. The man is patient as a drought and twice as destructive. I set the journal on my knee. I thought about Silver Creek running through Callaway Ridge's south pasture. I thought about Jesse's paper with Voss's seal. I thought about what Roy had told me about the woman who left on the 14th night. I thought about my father writing those words 3 years ago and dying before he could use them. I did not sleep much that night. Sunday morning, I made apple cake. The dried apples in the back of the pantry had been sitting since the previous fall. Waste offends me to my core, and those apples had done nothing to deserve their fate. I put the cake on the table after supper without a word. Kit's face when he saw it was the face of someone receiving something they had given up expecting. He said very quietly, Lord, that is apple cake. Big Sam said, my grandmother in Texas made that cake. I have not had it in 11 years. The table laughed. The tension that had been sitting in the room since I arrived lifted and became something else. Everett looked at me from the head of the table. Not an assessing look this time. Something quieter than that. Something he looked away from before I could read it fully. Roy Tanner ate 2 pieces. He said nothing. I had already learned that was the highest compliment he offered. I went to Silver Creek at first light on the 8th day and found fresh horse tracks on the bank. Shod horse. Unfamiliar pattern. Recent. Roy appeared behind me within a minute. He looked at the tracks and his face did something controlled that told me he had been expecting this for a while. He said, Silver Creek runs year-round through the south pasture. Only source of its kind in 3 counties. Whoever controls the water rights to this creek controls everything downstream. Land value, grazing rights, the economic future of a 40-mile radius. Voss has known this for 2 years. He has been building a legal case to challenge Everett's water rights ever since. I said, and now he is not being patient anymore. Roy said, no, he is not. That evening, I heard Everett and Roy talking in the study. The door was not fully latched. I was not trying to listen. The house was not large. Everett was saying, he sent a man to the south boundary last week. I saw the survey equipment. Roy said, He will file before the dry season makes his argument easier. Tom Garfield at the county assessor's office is already involved. A long silence. Then Everett said, "All right, just that." All right, in the tone of a man who has placed information where it belongs and will deal with it when dealing is required. I went back to the kitchen. I kept my hands moving. My mind would not slow down. The next morning, I waited until Everett had his coffee and had sat down in the way that meant he was willing to be spoken to. Then I said, without turning from the stove, "I heard you and Roy last night." I was not trying to listen. The door was open. He said, "I know." I turned around. I said, "Harlan Voss took my father's land. I know how he builds a case. I know the sequence of what comes next. And I need to tell you something I should have told you on the first day." He said, "Sit down." I sat. And I told him everything. The 14-year debt, the adjusted ledger, the lawyer from Denver, the Tuesday morning in the mud on Main Street. I told it flat and without heat because the heat had burned out of me weeks ago and what was left was just the facts of it. Clear and cold and useful. Everett listened without interrupting, without fidgeting, without the particular impatience of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is waiting for you to finish so he can say it. When I was done, he said, "Your name is Hadley." I said, "Clara Rose Hadley." He said, "Thomas Hadley was your father." I said, "Yes." He opened the desk drawer and took out an envelope. The letter inside was in my father's handwriting. I recognized it before I had read a single word. The particular slant of the letters, the careful space between sentences. I had been reading that handwriting my whole life. The letter was dated 6 weeks before he died. I read it at Everett's kitchen table with Everett watching me, and this is what it said. "Everett, I have been corresponding with you for 3 years about what Voss is doing in this county. You are the only rancher in this valley who has not been moved by his patience or his money, and I have spent those 3 years trying to understand how. I think I understand now. You are simply not afraid of him. I wish I had learned that earlier. I am not well. I do not expect to see another winter. I'm writing this because I have a daughter who is smarter about people than she knows and who will not have anywhere to go when Voss comes, and he will come. If Clara ever arrives at your gate looking for work, give it to her. She will earn it honestly. She knows more about how Voss operates than any lawyer in 3 counties. She just does not know she knows it yet. I trust you to see her clearly. I am asking that because I believe you are the kind of man who is worth asking. Your friend, Thomas Hadley." I set the letter on the table. My hands were not trembling slightly. They were shaking, full, visible shaking that I could not control or decide about. The first time since that Tuesday morning in the mud that my body did something I had not authorized it to do. I pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Everett did not speak. He gave me the full time it took and did not fill the silence. After a while I said, "He knew." Everett said, "He prepared. There is a difference. He did not know you would come here. He prepared for the possibility that you might." I said, "He trusted a man he had never met with the thing that mattered most to him." Everett said, "We had written back and forth for 3 years. I told him the truth about Voss, even when the truth was not easy to say. I think that was enough for him." A pause. He said, "I was going to drive to Copper Falls in May to testify about what Voss had been doing with the ledgers. He died in April." His voice changed slightly on those last words. Almost nothing. But I caught it. I said, "You feel responsible?" He did not answer. His jaw tightened. That was its own answer. I said, "You are not. You could not have gotten there sooner than he left." That same afternoon, Pearl Whitfield rode out from Copper Falls. She came alone and she asked for me specifically. Pearl owned the dress shop on Main Street. She was maybe 55 with the particular combination of sharp tongue and soft heart that makes a person genuinely useful in a crisis. We walked in the kitchen garden. She said, "I stood on that street corner and watched what happened to your father's things. I did not step forward. I am sorry for that. I am here to say it to your face because you deserve at least that much." I said, "Why are you really here?" She said, "Because there is something you need to know about your Aunt Doris." Doris Hadley was my father's sister, my only living relative. She had stood at the corner of Main Street that Tuesday morning. Our eyes had met. She had looked away first. What Pearl told me was this. In 1876, Doris had signed an affidavit confirming that Thomas Hadley was lacking in financial competence. It was the document Voss used to convince the county court to authorize the debt acceleration. In exchange, Voss had forgiven her husband's store debt. Doris had known for 2 years that she helped dismantle her brother's life. She had not told me. She was not planning to. I stood in the kitchen garden after Pearl left, and I felt the full weight of it. Not Voss. I had been building a case against Voss since before I knew I was building it. Voss was a known enemy. Known enemies have a shape you can fight. Doris was something else. Doris was the woman who brought food when my mother died, who sat with my father through the hard years, who I had looked at across a muddy street and seen look away. She had signed her name to her brother's ruin to save her husband's store debt. I sat on the garden fence alone for a long time. Everett found me there. He sat on the fence beside me, not close, and said nothing. He did not rush it. He did not fill the silence with the kind of comfort that is really just discomfort with someone else's pain. After a while, he said, "My brother Jesse has done things for money that he should not have done. I have been angry at him for it. But I know what it means to have family fail you and still be your family." I said, "How do you hold both of those things?" He said, "Badly, and then you get better at it." That was not comfort, it was truth. I needed truth more than comfort. When we stood to go back inside, his hand found mine briefly. Not romantic. Steadying, the way you steady someone on uncertain ground. He let go before it became anything else. I noticed the moment he let go. Voss came on a Friday with a good wagon, a county assessor named Mrs. Aldrich, and Deputy Cal Monroe riding alongside. I heard the wagon from the kitchen. I knew the sound by then. I went out the back door and came around the side of the house before Everett had emerged from the barn. Voss saw me before he saw Everett. Recognition moved across his face slowly, and then all at once. He said, "Miss Hadley, I did not expect to find you here." I said, "Mr. Voss, Mr. Calloway will be with you shortly. You are welcome to wait." He looked me over, slowly, completely, the way he had always looked at me, making the looking visible, making it a statement. I did not move, did not shift, did not apologize for the space I occupied. Everett came out of the barn. He took in the scene. Then he took in me, standing in the yard. And something settled in his expression. He walked to stand beside me. Not in front, beside. One step that changed the geometry of what Voss was looking at. Voss presented a county court order for a survey of the south pasture. Water rights verification, he called it. Standard procedure. Everett said, "No survey on my land without my lawyer present." Voss said, "This is a county matter, Everett. Mrs. Aldrich is county appointed." Everett said, "She can come back Tuesday when George Whitmore is here." Voss shifted. He looked at me. He said, "Your father was a stubborn man, too. Held onto that land 12 years past, when he should have let it go sensibly. He would have saved himself considerable grief if he had." The yard went quiet. Everett went still beside me. Not his usual stillness. The stillness of a man holding back something that wants badly to come forward. I spoke before he did. I said, "My father paid that debt in full 4 times over, Mr. Voss. The ledger you showed the court was not the ledger he signed. You and I both know that. The whole county would know it too, if they cared to look at the original figures." I held his eyes. I said, "He did not lose his land because he was stubborn. He lost it because you had better lawyers and more patience, and you decided what you wanted years before he knew you had decided anything." I paused. I said, "I am not my father. I see it coming." The silence after that had weight. Voss looked at me with something cold and assessing moving behind his eyes. The look of a man who has just identified which thing in a room is going to give him the most trouble. Everett said, "You know the road out." Voss looked at them both. Then he turned his wagon and drove out. The county woman followed, Monroe last, not looking at anyone. After they were gone, I went back to the kitchen. 20 minutes later, Everett came in. He said, "You should not have said that to him. About the ledger. You gave him information about what you know and what you can prove." I turned around. I said, With respect, Mr. Calloway, I have been managing what I know and what I can prove around Harlan Voss since I was old enough to read my father's account books. Do not tell me how to handle a man you have been watching from a distance for 2 years. I went back to what I was doing. The door did not quite slam. Close. Roy was in the yard when Everett came out. I could hear them through the open window. Roy said, "She is not wrong." A long pause, then Everett said, "I know she is not wrong." Roy said, "Then what was that?" Another pause. Everett said, "I do not know." Later I found out from Dutch Reeves what I had not been able to see in the yard. Deputy Cal Monroe, county law, had been Voss's instrument for 3 years. Every property transfer Voss had engineered in this county, Monroe's signature was on the authorization. Peterson Place, Clary Ranch, others. The law in this county was Voss's law. There was a difference. A Colorado storm came in fast that evening. Everyone inside, kitchen full of bodies and warmth, and the particular comfort of people sheltering together from something larger than any of them. Everett did not come to supper. Roy brought him a plate. Came back with it uneaten. After the crew settled, I filled 2 cups and knocked on the study door. He said, "Come in." I set a cup on his desk, sat in the chair across, did not speak first. After a while he said, "What I said in the yard was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "I watched him look at you that way, and I wanted to do the thing I did not have the right to do yet. And instead I said the wrong thing." I said, "What was the right thing?" He met my eyes. He said, "To stand between you and that look he gave you." I said, "That is not your job." He said, "No, it is not." The rain hit the window. Neither of us looked away. He said, "My wife, Catherine, would have said exactly what you said, exactly how you said it, and I would have said the same wrong thing to her." I said, "Did she forgive you?" Almost a smile. He said, "Every time. She said I was better at being wrong than any man she had ever met, and I might as well practice being forgiven since I was so good at earning it." I said, "She sounds like she was worth knowing." He said, "She was the best person I have known." He paused. He said, "Until recently." The silence after that was careful and warm, and we both let it sit there. Before bed, I saw Jesse come in late, wet through, with a bruise starting on his jaw. As he passed me in the hallway, something fell from his jacket pocket. The paper. The same paper, same seal. This time I picked it up before he could. I read one line before he turned around. A schedule. Callaway Ridge crew rotations, south pasture hours. Jesse took it from my hand. We looked at each other. He knew I had read it. I knew he knew. Neither of us said anything. Yet. I went to Roy the next morning with what I had seen, both instances. The paper, the seal, the schedule. Roy sat down. He looked suddenly older. The kind of aging that happens to a person's face in one moment when they receive something they have been afraid of receiving. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Suspected since the first week, certain since last night." He said, "Voss bought his debts. Jesse has been in Pueblo 3 times since February. The kind of debt that takes you to Pueblo 3 times does not negotiate itself." I said, "Everett does not know." Roy said, "No." I said, "He needs to." Roy said, "Yes. And the only question is whether Jesse tells him or we do." I said, "Give me the morning." I found Jesse in the barn, alone, working on a harness with the focused attention of a man who is trying very hard not to think about something. I said, "I need to talk to you." He looked up. The easy grin was gone. I told him what I knew, all of it. I did not soften it, and I did not make it comfortable. He had made it comfortable for himself long enough. He denied it first, then got angry. Then the thing underneath both of those fell away, and what was left was a kind of exhausted collapse, like a man who has been holding something up for so long that being caught is almost a relief. He said, 6 months, schedules, patrol times, water level measurements during dry weeks. I told myself it would not matter. I said, "You were helping the man who is trying to take your brother's ranch. The only thing your brother has left after Catherine died." Jesse flinched like I had struck him. He said, "I know." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the debt was real, and Voss was the only one who offered a way out, and I told myself I was not doing anything that would actually. I said, "Stop." He stopped. I said, "There is no end to that sentence that sounds like anything except what it is." He looked at his hands. I said, "You have until tonight to tell Everett yourself. If you do not, I will. And it will go considerably better coming from you." The hours between that conversation and evening were some of the longest I had spent at Callaway Ridge. I worked, bread, supper prep. The physical rhythm of the kitchen, which does not wait for personal crises and is better for that. Mid-afternoon, Everett came in for water and stopped when he saw my face. He said, "Something happened." I said, "Yes." He said, "You are not going to tell me yet." I said, "Not yet. Tonight." He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I understood he was deciding whether to push. He decided not to. He got his water and went back out. That decision, to take not yet from me and wait, told me something important about Everett Callaway, more than the biscuits conversation, more than the handshake. He trusted me enough to wait. I had not expected that. I should have. But I had not. Jesse knocked on the study door at 8 that evening. I was in the kitchen. I heard voices through the walls. Not the words, the tone of them. Everett's voice, low and controlled. Jesse's voice, less steady. Then a long silence. Then the sound of Jesse's voice cracking through like a boy's. When Jesse came through the kitchen an hour later, his eyes were red, and his face was wiped clean of the easy grin. Without it, he looked younger. He looked like Everett's brother. He stopped when he saw me. He said, "Everett told me that you gave me the chance to tell him myself." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I know what it is to have one person left, and I did not want to be the one who cost your brother his." Jesse looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, small, serious, nothing of the charm in it. And he went to his room. Everett came to the kitchen afterward. He sat at the table, and I put a cup in front of him and sat across. He said, "He is staying. He works off what he owes. 2 years. I will buy the debt from Voss, and Jesse pays me back in labor." I said, "That is generous." He said, "It is practical. He is the only family I have." He paused. "And he knows it now. He did not before. Or he forgot." I said, "What Voss now knows about the schedules and patrol patterns," Everett said, "we change everything, routes, rotations, timing. We assume Voss has a 6-month picture and we build around it." I said, "That is the right instinct." He said, "Your father's journal. Is there anything in it about how Voss moves when he thinks he has enough information?" I got the journal. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours working through it together. Not rancher and cook. Two people working the same problem from different sides. At one point, I reached across the table to turn the journal toward him, and our hands were suddenly very close on the same page, and neither of us moved right away. Then I went back to my side of the table. He continued reading. Nothing happened, except that it did. That night, I lay in my small room and thought about my father's words in that letter. She knows more about how Voss operates than any lawyer in 3 counties. She just does not know she knows it yet. I was beginning to know it. And I was beginning to understand something else. The reason Voss had never been successfully challenged in this county was not that he was smarter than everyone else. It was that the people he went after had always been alone. Thomas Hadley was alone. The woman before me, Clara Marsh, had been alone. I was not alone, not anymore. I thought about that for a long time before I slept. Big Sam came back from the supply run on a Monday with a face like a man carrying something heavy he would rather put down anywhere but here. He waited until the crew scattered after supper. Then he came to the kitchen and sat at the table and said, "There is talk in town about you being here." I kept washing the pot in my hands. I said, "What kind of talk?" He said, "The kind that comes from one source and travels fast because it is the kind of talk people like to repeat. Voss has been in 2 saloons and the dry goods store since Friday. The story he is telling is that Everett Callaway has taken up with his cook. That it is not a professional arrangement. He tells it pleasantly. He lets people fill in the rest." I set the pot down carefully. I said, "Does Everett know?" Sam said, "He has known since this afternoon." I dried my hands. I said, "I will be on the porch." Everett came around the side of the house 40 minutes later and saw me on the step and stopped. I said, Sam told me. Sam told me that you already knew. He sat beside me, the respectful distance he always maintained between us. He said, the first thing I felt was anger. The second thing I felt was something I did not have the right to act on yet. I needed to work out the difference before I talked to you. I said, what was the second thing? A pause. He said, protective, in a way that goes past an employer's concern for an employee. I said, what did you decide? He said, that you deserve to know what was being said regardless of what I feel, and I should have told you immediately. That was wrong. I said, yes, it was. He said, I am sorry. I said, I know. We sat for a moment. Then I said, I am going to town tomorrow. He said, Roy goes with you. I said, I go alone. We looked at each other in the evening dark. He said, noon. Be back by noon. I wore my good dress. Dark blue wool kept folded at the bottom of my canvas bag since the day I arrived. I wore it because I was not going to Copper Falls looking like a woman with anything to hide. The wagon came down Main Street, and I felt the attention the way you feel a change in weather. Not visible, not a crowd stopping, just the micro-adjustment of a small town when the thing it has been talking about walks into the room. I got down and walked into the dry goods store with my list. The woman behind the counter was 60, gray-haired, with the worn and capable look of someone who has been running a business for 30 years. She took my measure in one steady look. I said, I have a list, and I am Clara Rose Hadley. I am the cook out at Callaway Ridge. Pleasure to meet you properly, Mrs. Morton. Agnes Morton looked at my list, looked at me, neutral, waiting. I said, do you bake your own bread? That surprised her. She said, I do. I said, I have been fighting the altitude. My biscuits were coming out a quarter-inch shorter than they should for the first 2 weeks. Did you find a reliable adjustment? She came around the counter and began pulling flour from the shelf. She said, half a teaspoon more leavening. Roll them a touch thicker. I said, does that not make them tough? She said, not if you do not overwork the dough. We were 3 minutes into a genuine conversation about biscuits before either of us had decided to have one. I saw Voss across the street when I came out of the post office. He was leaving the land office with a man I did not recognize. He saw me at the same moment. 3 full seconds, across the width of Main Street. Nothing between us but August air and everything already said. I did not look away, did not adjust my posture, stood exactly as I was, as a woman who has done nothing wrong and knows it and intends him to know it too. Something moved across his face that I had not seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, something that looked almost like the beginning of doubt. Then he turned and walked the other direction. I collected Callaway Ridge's mail and walked back to the wagon. I returned to good news. Martin Cross, Everett's lawyer in Harlow, had sent word that Voss's current survey order had a procedural defect, filed under the wrong county statute. It would be rejected by the court clerk without a hearing. The crew at supper was lighter than it had been in weeks. Big Sam told a story about a mule that went on considerably longer than necessary and was funnier for it. Kit laughed until he choked on his biscuit. Even Frank Ogle cracked something that passed for a smile. Everett looked at me across the table, and something passed between us that was easy and warm, the way things are between people who have weathered something together. I thought, maybe it is turning. I went to bed that night almost believing it. I should have known better. My father raised me to know better. The next hard thing was already awake and moving toward us. Martin Cross sent a second letter 2 days later. He came in person to deliver it, which told me before I read it that the news was worse than the previous news had been good. Voss had filed his water rights challenge with the federal court in Denver. Not the county court. Federal. Which meant Tom Garfield's influence at the county assessor's office was worth nothing. Which meant the timeline had expanded from months to potentially years, and the costs had expanded accordingly. Everett read it at the breakfast table after the crew left. Set it face down. I refilled his coffee. Sat. He said, federal court takes 18 months at minimum. The legal costs would run us close to the edge. I said, my father's journal has documentation of 3 payments that Voss's own bookkeeper witnessed. If that bookkeeper is still alive and can be found. He said, that is a large if. I said, yes, But it is the only if that changes the federal case entirely. I said his name was Edward Crane. He left Voss 2 years ago. I found the name in my father's notes. Everett said, I will have Roy start asking around. I said, let me find him. This is my father's case. I want to be the one. He looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded. That afternoon was ordinary, deceptively ordinary. Everett sat at the kitchen table mending harness while I worked the last of the summer fruit into preserves. We talked, not about Voss, not about the journal, about small things. Colorado winters versus Kansas winters. Whether Kit was going to grow another 4 inches before spring, what the mountains looked like in November. At one point he reached past me for something on the high shelf, and he was very close and very still, and I was very still, and neither of us moved for a moment. That was 2 beats too long to be anything but deliberate. Then he got the jar lid. Then he went back to the table. Nothing happened, except the kitchen had changed temperature in some way that was not about the stove. Kit came in from the yard a minute later to ask a question, read the room in about a quarter of a second, asked his question very fast, and left. Wise boy. I woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke. A moment of not understanding. Then the smell hit harder, and I was out of bed and down the hall before I'd consciously decided to move. The south barn was on fire, not a small fire, not a spark that caught. A deliberate fire, fully engaged, the kind that has been helped. Kit Dalton was in there. He had been sleeping in the hay on hot nights for 2 weeks because his bunk room faced west and held the heat. Everyone knew this, including, it appeared, Harlan Voss. The yard erupted into controlled chaos. Roy went for the horses. Big Sam and Dutch hit the water line. Nate and Frank at the pump. Jesse, who I would not have expected, ran to help Roy without being asked. Everett went into the burning barn before anyone could say anything. He simply went in. I do not know what I did then exactly. I know I was at the barn door calling Kit's name, and the smoke was a wall, and I could not see. And then Roy had his arms around me, and I was fighting him because Kit was in there and Everett was in there. They came out together. Everett with Kit over his shoulder, Kit unconscious. Everett's jacket burning at the shoulder. Big Sam threw a bucket. The fire on Everett's jacket went out. Kit landed on the grass. Everett dropped to his knees beside the boy. Kit breathed. I checked. He breathed. Gray dawn came up over the smoking ruin of the south barn. Roy found what he was looking for in the wreckage. A glass bottle, oil-soaked rags, and on the rags, a particular pattern of weave that I recognized. The supply rags from the Voss Land and Banking Building in Copper Falls. I had seen them dozens of times when I went to make my father's payments. Roy said this was not an accident. Everett looked at the ruin. He said no. I could see what it cost him, not the barn. The barn was wood and nails and could be rebuilt. It was the knowledge that the man across the valley had burned a building, knowing a 17-year-old boy might be inside it. Later, I made Everett sit at the kitchen table, and I unwrapped what was under his jacket. The burn was real. Not catastrophic, but real. I cleaned it and dressed it, and he did not make a sound the entire time. When I was tying off the bandage, he said, I was afraid. Not of the fire, of what it means that Voss will burn a building with a person inside. He is not patient anymore. He is making the moves of a man who knows he is running out of options. I said, which means he is making mistakes. Everett looked at me. The full, unguarded look of a man who has stopped managing what shows on his face. He said, you are not afraid. I said, I am terrified. But terrified and finished are different things. Something in his face shifted, opened, wider than I had seen it before. He said, Clara. I said, yes. He did not say the next thing. He just looked at me, and I understood that what he was not saying was large and real, and not yet ready to be words. I stood up. I said, I will sit with Kit. He said, Clara. I stopped at the doorway. He said, thank you. Not for the bandage. Both of us knew that. I said, get some sleep. I will wake you if he worsens. Kit woke 2 hours later. He looked at the ceiling and said, did we lose the horses? I said, not one. He closed his eyes. He said, good. Then, is there any apple cake left? I said, I will make you another one. He said, I would appreciate that. I made it before breakfast, put it on the table while the crew came in quiet and subdued and still carrying the weight of the night. Big Sam cut the first piece, ate it, set his fork down. He said, "Okay." Not to anyone in particular, just okay. And that was the thing that steadied the room. I found Edward Crane through Pearl Whitfield, who knows everyone in 4 counties, and is not quiet about it. I had written to Pearl asking if she knew of a small, precise man named Edward Crane, formerly employed by Voss, who had left 2 years ago. Pearl wrote back in 4 days with an address in Mesa Bend, 40 miles east. I told Everett at breakfast. He said, "Jesse goes with you." I started to argue. He said, "I am not asking because I do not trust you to handle yourself. I am asking because Jesse needs something to do that costs him something." I looked at Jesse across the table. Jesse was looking at his plate. I said, "All right." Jesse drove the 40 miles mostly in silence. He broke it once. He said, "I want to say something, not another apology. I already did that." I said, "Say it then." He said, "You gave me the chance to tell Everett myself. That cost you something. If I had refused, you would have had to do it, and it would have gone worse for everyone." I said, "I gave you the chance for your brother, not for you." He said, "I know that." He paused. "Everett has more than one person now." He said it without looking at me. I did not answer, but I felt it land somewhere in my chest, quiet and true. Mesa Bend was a small town, the kind of place people go when they want to be somewhere that does not remember them. Edward Crane's house was modest and tidy, the careful small home of a man who has learned to live with less than he once had. He opened the door. Small man, precise as my father had written, older than his years. He looked at me, his face went pale. He said, "Come in, please come in, please." Inside on the mantel was a photograph. A young woman, maybe 20, dark hair, a quality of stillness in her face that I had seen somewhere, in a mirror. I said, "Who is that?" Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her name was Eleanor Crane, my younger sister. She died in 1847 of a fever after childbirth." I said, "What was her married name?" He said, "Hadley, Eleanor Hadley." I stood very still. I said, "She was my mother." He said, "Yes." He sat across from me at his kitchen table and said it plainly, because he had run out of the energy required to be anything other than honest. He had adjusted Thomas Hadley's ledger on Voss's instruction in 1876 and again in 1878. He had known the name on the file. He had known Thomas Hadley was his sister's husband. He had done it anyway. He said, "I told myself the family connection had been severed, that it was not my concern. I told myself Voss's money was necessary." He folded his hands on the table. He said, "I left 2 years ago when Voss moved to take the land. I could not watch what the end of it looked like. But I kept everything. Every record, every adjusted figure, every document with Voss's instructions on it." He got up. He lifted a floorboard in the corner and brought out a box. Inside, 8 years of documentation. Every irregularity Voss had engineered. Not just the Hadley account. 5 families. With dates, amounts, and Crane's own signed notation on each one. I looked at it for a long time. I said, "Will you testify?" He said, "Yes, I will testify." I said, "I am not going to tell you I forgive you, because I do not. Not yet. Maybe I will. My father was capable of forgiving things I am not capable of. That was one of the ways he was better than me." I looked at the photograph on the mantel. My mother at 20, before I was born, before everything. I said, "But I am here, and you are going to testify, and that is a beginning, if you want it to be." Crane looked at his hands for a long time. He said, "It is more than I deserve." I said, "Probably, but my father would have offered it anyway." The drive back was long and quiet until Jesse said, "You all right?" I said, "Working on it." He said, "That was a lot to take in." I said, "Yes, he will testify. That changes everything." Jesse was quiet. Then he said, "You trust Everett?" I said, "Yes, I think I do." Jesse nodded. We drove the rest of the way without talking. But it was the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other, not the careful silence of two people who do not. Everett was in the yard when we came through the gate, not pretending he had not been watching for us. He looked at my face as I climbed down. He said, "You found him." I said, "Yes." He said, "He will testify?" I said, "Yes." He let out a breath. The first time I had seen him do that without deciding to first. I said, "There is more." He said, "Come inside." I told him everything at the kitchen table, the photograph, Eleanor, the box under the floorboard, what Crane said, and what I said back. Everett listened, the way he always listened, completely, without hurrying it. When I finished, he said, "Are you all right?" "Not about the case, about me." I looked at him. I said, "I think I will be." He nodded. He said, "That is enough for tonight." He put his hand over mine on the table, the deliberate, careful gesture I had catalogued 100 times. This time he did not withdraw it. I turned my hand over and held his. We sat like that while the lamp burned low and the ranch went quiet around us. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Martin Cross arrived at Callaway Ridge on a Tuesday and read Crane's documentation for 4 hours in the study. When he came out, he looked like a man who's been given a gift he was not expecting. He said, "This is sufficient for federal fraud prosecution. 5 counts, criminal, not civil. With Crane's testimony, we can also file for return of all fraudulently acquired properties." I said, "Including the Hadley land." He said, "Including the Hadley land." He looked at Everett. He said, "The water rights challenge is dismissed. The federal filing was built on fraudulent county documentation. Garfield's involvement, Monroe's signatures, the whole structure collapses." Everett said, "How long?" Cross said, 6 weeks for an emergency injunction halting all of Voss's activities. 3 months for the criminal referral to be formally accepted. Voss found out before the papers were filed. Small towns have ears, and Mesa Bend was no exception. He moved fast, faster than he had moved in 2 years of careful patience, which told me everything I needed to know. He was frightened. Frightened men make mistakes. 3 of his men arrived at the gate the next morning with Deputy Monroe requesting access to a material witness for county verification purposes. I was watching from the kitchen window when they rode up. I had been preparing for this for 3 days. I took the envelope from the counter and went out. Everett was at the gate. Behind him, Roy, Big Sam, Dutch, Frank, Nate, and Jesse standing beside his brother. Not behind, beside. Monroe made his demand in careful legal language. I walked forward, past Everett, and handed Monroe the envelope. I said, "Deputy Monroe, those are certified copies of the documentation currently in transit to the federal court in Denver. The originals left this morning with a bonded courier." I looked at him steadily. I said, "The cover letter includes a request for review of several official county documents, survey orders, witness certifications, property transfer authorizations, all bearing your signature. Your name appears 7 times in connection with 6 separate property transfers, all to Harlan Voss." Monroe looked at the envelope. "At Voss's men, at Everett." Then he turned his horse and rode. Voss's men, without Monroe, had no legal cover. They followed. The yard was quiet. Big Sam said, "Is it done?" Everett said, "The first wall came down." Roy looked at me with the long, measuring look of a man who has been watching and deciding for 2 months. He said, "Miss Hadley." I said, "Mr. Tanner." He said, "Good work." Coming from Roy Tanner, 11 years at Callaway Ridge, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Voss came alone 2 hours later. No wagon, no entourage, no legal scaffolding, just a man on a horse at the gate of a ranch that was no longer afraid of him. He still held himself well. He still had the bearing of a man accustomed to being agreed with. But something had shifted. The certainty was thinner. He said, "Everett, I would like to propose a negotiation." Everett said, "There is nothing to negotiate." Voss said, "The water rights," Everett said, "are properly filed and will be affirmed by the federal court. You know that." Voss's eyes moved to me. "One last calculation." He said, "Your cook has been remarkably involved in ranch business." Everett said, "She has." She is going to continue to be. Voss looked at me then. That look, the one that took its time and made itself visible and was meant to say, I see what you are, and you are less than you imagine. I met it, straight and still. The full weight of a woman who has been looked at that way her entire life and has decided it costs her nothing anymore. He tried once more. He said, your father was a stubborn man. I said, you said that before. My answer is the same. Everett said, the documents are in Denver, Harlan. The courier left at 7 this morning. You are smart enough to know what the next 6 weeks look like. Voss held for one more moment. Then he turned his horse. He rode out without another word, cold to the last, not begging, not raging, simply finished. That evening, after supper, after the crew had scattered into the ordinary sounds of a ranch winding down for the night, Everett and I stood in the yard as the sun went down behind the Rocky Mountains in that particular Colorado gold that takes the whole sky. He said, you have been here 7 weeks. I said 6 weeks and 4 days. He said, you walked through that gate with 47 cents and a pair of boots that should have been retired 3 years ago. I said 47 cents and my father's journal. He said, and you have changed every single thing about how this ranch functions, not the cooking. The cooking was obvious from the first biscuit, everything else. I looked at him. I said, you are going somewhere with this. He said, I am. I said, then get there. He almost smiled. Then he did. The real one, the full one, the one that changed his face entirely, younger and open and the thing underneath all the settled stillness. I had been waiting to see it completely since the first week. He said, I have not slept a full night in 4 years, since Catherine. I would wake at 2 in the morning and lie there with the weight of everything this place needed that I could not provide alone. Since you came, I sleep. And every morning, first thing, before the barn, before the pasture, I look toward the kitchen. I said quietly, I look toward the yard. He reached up and put his hand against my face, the way he had been almost doing for weeks. This time he left it there. He said, I would like to court you properly, at whatever pace you need, with whatever you require from me. I am not asking for anything except the right to try. I said, and if I said slow, he said then slow. I said, and honest? He said, always. I looked at this man who had looked at my face the first day and shaken my hand like I was worth the full force of one, who had sat on a fence beside me and not tried to fix the unfixable, who had gone into a burning barn because a boy was inside, who had been wrong twice and acknowledged it both times before anyone asked him to. I said, then yes, on those terms. He leaned down and kissed me, careful and certain, the way he did everything. Colorado evening all around us, mountains watching, the ranch sounds continuing behind us, ordinary and ongoing. My father had known. He had always known before I did. Martin Cross arrived in person 6 weeks later, which told me before he spoke that the news was the kind that deserves a face attached to it. He sat at the kitchen table with Everett and me and Roy, and he said, the federal injunction is in place. Voss's property activities are frozen entirely. The criminal referral has been accepted by the court. Tom Garfield has resigned from the county assessor's office. Cal Monroe surrendered his badge under pressure 3 days ago. He opened his case and set a document on the table. He said, the original Hadley transaction has been voided by the court. The deed reverts to the Hadley estate. Miss Hadley, you are listed as sole heir. I looked at the document. My father's name was on it, Thomas R. Hadley. Original deed holder, restored. I put both hands flat on the paper. I could not speak for a moment. I just kept my hands on that paper with his name on it. Everett, beside me, said nothing. He put his hand over mine on the document and let me have the moment without filling it. After a while, I said, thank you, Mr. Cross. Cross looked at Everett and said, thank your cook. I have been a lawyer for 30 years. I have never had a client hand me a complete evidentiary package already organized and certified. Everett looked at me. He said, I know. A letter came from Doris 2 weeks after that, her handwriting. I recognized it and set it on the table and went back to what I was doing. Came back to it an hour later. It was short. It was inadequate. It was the letter of a woman who has known for 2 years that she did an unforgivable thing, and has finally run out of reasons not to say so. She did not ask forgiveness. She said she was sorry. She said she thought about Thomas every day. She said she did not expect a response. I read it twice, folded it along its original creases, put it in the drawer of my room. I did not respond. That was also an answer, and it was mine to give in my own time, at my own pace, or not at all. My father would have responded. He was a bigger person than me in that particular way. I was working on it. Jesse found me at the garden fence 3 days after the letter came. He handed me an envelope without preamble. Inside was money, enough to repair the roof of the Hadley house in Copper Falls. Not everything. A beginning. He said, "I cannot fix what I broke, but I have been thinking about what you said, that you gave me the chance because you know what it is to have one person left." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to be worth keeping, to Everett, and to this." He meant the ranch, the table, the thing we were all building together. I said, "You are already worth keeping. You just have to keep showing up." He nodded, went back to work. No easy grin. Just a man walking across a yard towards something he intended to earn. He was beginning to look like his brother in the ways that mattered. Kit came to me on a Thursday morning with a letter in his hand. He held it out without speaking. It was from his mother in Kansas. She was coming in November. Taking the stage. I read it, handed it back. I said, "You should make sure there is apple cake when she arrives." Kit looked at me. He said, "Could you show me how to make it?" "So I can make it myself." For her. I said, "We will make it together." He nodded, went back out. I watched him cross the yard in the morning light and thought about what Luther, in some other story I would never know, once said to a woman in a similar kitchen. "You are good at people." I thought he would have been right. Everett and I rode to Copper Falls on a Saturday morning, the first time I had been back together with someone since the day I walked out alone. We stopped at the Hadley house, grass grown up, porch rail down on one end, windows needing work. But standing, still standing after everything my father and Voss and time had put it through. Everett said, "What do you want to do with it?" I looked at the house for a long time. I thought about the 22 years my father had spent making it into a home. I thought about the morning it was no longer ours. I said, "Fix it. Find a family who needs a start and rent it at a fair price. Keep the Hadley name on the deed." He said, "And you?" I turned to look at him on horseback beside me in the morning light. I said, "My home is at Callaway Ridge, Everett. Is at Something in his face that I had learned to read, the thing that got past the stillness when he let it, moved and settled. He said, "Say that again." I said, "My home is at Callaway Ridge." He reached over and took my hand. We sat on horseback outside my father's house for a long time without talking, letting the fact of it exist, letting it be real. We stopped at Pearl Whitfield's dress shop on the way back. Pearl came out to the street before we dismounted. She looked at us together, looked at our hands. Her face did something that was not quite a smile, more a deep and satisfied nod. She said, "Come in, I have something for you." Inside was a dress. Dark blue wool, fine and careful, cut with the skill of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. Not elaborate, not fussy. Exactly right. I said, "Pearl, when did you—" She said, "June. I have been making it since June." I said, "You did not know." She said, "I made it anyway." A woman who walks 7 miles in August heat for a job she was not certain she would get is the kind of woman who ends up somewhere worth dressing up for. I was prepared to be wrong. She was not wrong. When we came back through the Callaway Ridge gate that afternoon, Everett took my hand at the crossbar and walked me around the back of the house. There was a new addition, framing up, walls 2/3 done, roof partially shingled. A room, larger than my current room, windows on 2 sides. I said, "When did you start this?" He said, "Week 3. I said, "You started this in week 3. He said, "Yes." I said, "Before you knew anything about how I felt." He said, "Yes." I said, "Everett." "That is," he said, "I know. I have been told I express things in unusual ways." I laughed, fully and freely, the laugh that comes before you have decided how to respond. He watched it happen with the expression of a man storing something up. That evening, after supper, after the crew had gone, Everett sat at the kitchen table and I sat across, and the lamp burned between us the way it had burned on dozens of evenings before this one. He took a ring from his pocket and set it on the table between us. Small, plain, warm gold, his grandmother's. He said, "Catherine never wore it. She said it was not suited to hands that worked the way hers did." He looked at it. He said, "I think my grandmother would have disagreed with her on that." I looked at the ring, then at him. He said, "You said slow. I am keeping that promise. This is not a demand, it is a direction." He left it on the table. I looked at it for a long moment, the small gold thing that had been waiting. Then I picked it up, put it on my finger. I said, "I walked 7 miles to get here. I am not a woman who takes long to recognize the right direction." He reached across and took my hand, the ring warm between our palms, his fingers steady and sure around mine. Outside, Colorado dark, stars beginning, the ranch settling into its nighttime sounds, everything in its place, horses and wind and something distant and wild. He said, "Clara?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The south barn. When we rebuild it, add a window on the east side. Kit likes morning light." I looked at him. This man, this careful, honest, unhurried man. I said, "Add 2 windows." He said, "2 windows." He brought my hand up and held it against his chest, and we sat like that in the lamplight while the ranch went quiet and the mountains stood in the dark, and everything that needed to be said had been said. In the morning, I was up before the ranch. Fire in the big iron range, coffee on, the ordinary miracle of an ordinary day. I carried my cup out to the yard, walked to the gate, stood at the crossbar with the single burned letter on it. I was standing on the inside, looking out at the road. 7 miles of Colorado road going east toward Copper Falls, toward the house with the Hadley name on the deed, toward the town that had watched and done nothing, toward a Tuesday morning in the mud that felt like a lifetime ago. I thought about the woman who had come over that last rise 7 weeks ago and looked at this gate from the other side, who had 47 cents and worn-out boots and a dead man's journal, and just enough stubbornness left to walk through a strange gate and ask for what she needed. That woman had nothing. This woman had a kitchen and a crew and a man who had started building her a room in week 3 before he knew anything except that he wanted a reason for her to stay. This woman had her father's name back on a deed. This woman had a ring on her finger that fit like it had always been waiting. Everett's boots on the porch, then on the yard, then beside me at the gate. He stood there with his own cup and looked out at the road with me. After a while he said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I am thinking about the morning I walked in from that direction." He said, "What about it?" I said, "Last time I stood at this gate, I was on the other side of it." He said, "Yes." I said, "I am never going to the other side of it again." He looked at me. That open, unguarded look that cost him something every time and that he gave anyway now freely. He said, "No, you are not." He took my hand. We turned back toward the house. The kitchen, the fire, the breakfast that 8 people were going to need in an hour. The gate stood behind us. The sea on the crossbar caught the first light. And I thought, my father wrote in that journal every night until the night he could not anymore. He wrote down every figure, every payment, every name, because he understood that the written record was the only thing standing between a working man and a man with better lawyers. He was right about that, but he was also right about something else, something he put in a letter to a man he had never met, trusting that the letter would matter, trusting that his daughter would find her way to where it could matter. She knows more than she knows she knows. I trust you to see her clearly. He saw me clearly, and I saw him. And the road that had brought me here, all 7 miles of dust and rock and August heat and worn-out boots, that road had not been punishment. It had been the way. I walked into the kitchen. The fire was good. The stove was excellent. I had told Everett that on the 2nd week, and I had meant it then, and I meant it more now. I began to make biscuits. Behind me, Everett sat at the table in the early light with his coffee and watched me work, the way he had been watching me work for 7 weeks, and the way he would watch me work for every morning after this one. He did not say anything. He did not need to. This was home. Finally, completely, irreversibly mine. November 1879. First snow on the mountains, the yard cold and dry, the sky that particular clear blue that only comes in Colorado when the season has finally made up its mind. We married at the gate, because I wanted the gate there. Everett said nothing about that choice, which meant he understood it completely. Pearl Whitfield came from Copper Falls. Agnes Morton came with a jar of apple preserves and cried and did not apologize for it. Martin Cross attended in his best suit and made a toast that was technically a legal brief and was also the most heartfelt thing anyone said all day. Roy Tanner stood beside Everett. He had stood beside Everett for 12 years. He was not going to stop now. Big Sam wept without restraint. Frank Ogle handed him a handkerchief and told him to hold it together. Big Sam continued weeping. Frank Ogle put his arm around him. Kit Dalton's mother had come in October and stayed. She watched her son hand Everett the ring and stood with her hand over her mouth, and her face said every word she could not. Jesse stood in the front, Everett's family, present and accountable, building something real, one day at a time. It was working. You could see it in the way he stood, less easy, more solid. Edward Crane sat in the back. I had written to him. He had come. After the ceremony, he found me in the small crowd and said, "Your mother would have been so proud." I looked at him. I said, "She raised a man who kept records. Eventually that mattered. It was not forgiveness yet. It was not its absence. It was something honest and alive and ongoing, the way all real things are." After the last wagon left and the yard was quiet, Everett and I stood at the gate in the first light snow. It was not heavy, just the suggestion of it. A few flakes in the gray air coming off the mountains. He said, "Well." I said, "Well." He said, "Mrs. Calloway." I looked at him. The name was new. It would take some wearing. He said, "You have time." I said, "How much time?" He looked at me with the full, open look of a man who has decided something and means it from the center of himself outward. He said, "All of it." I took his hand. The snow came down a little heavier. The mountains stood behind the gate the way they had stood for longer than anyone living could remember and would stand long after any of us were gone. The ranch was warm behind us. Lamplight in every window. The sound of Big Sam's laugh rolling out of the kitchen, large and uncomplicated, full of the particular satisfaction of a man whose world has come right. Clara Rose Calloway, who had been Clara Rose Hadley, who had been the woman in the mud on a Tuesday morning, who had been 47 cents in a dead man's journal and 7 miles of road. I looked at the gate, at the mountains, at my husband standing beside me in the first snow of the year. I did not feel like I had survived. I felt like I had arrived. And the road behind me, all 7 miles of it, had been the way home all along. I just had not known the address yet. Now I did. I knew it down to the bone. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
This story is, at its heart, a Western about dignity, endurance, and the slow, stubborn triumph of truth over power. On the surface, it tells of land stolen, a cruel banker, a hard ranch, and a woman fighting her way back from ruin. But underneath all that dust, fire, and law, the deeper meaning is this: a person's worth does not come from wealth, status, or the judgment of a town. It comes from character, from courage, and from the refusal to surrender one's soul when life tries to strip everything else away. Clara Rose Hadley begins her journey with almost nothing: 47 cents, worn boots, her father's journal, and a heart that has been bruised by grief, humiliation, and loneliness. Yet she does not collapse. She walks forward. That walk of 7 miles is more than a journey from one ranch to another. It symbolizes the moral road every human being must walk when life leaves them broken. The road is painful, uncertain, and often lonely, but it is still the road to self-respect, justice, and home. One of the story's strongest lessons is that evil often works through patience, silence, and systems, not only through open violence. Harlan Voss is dangerous not because he shouts the loudest, but because he manipulates the law, exploits weakness, and counts on fear to keep good people isolated. The story warns us that injustice thrives when communities stand by and do nothing. The people on the boardwalk who watched Clara kneel in the mud are part of that moral failure. In that way, the story teaches that neutrality in the face of wrong is never truly neutral. At the same time, the story offers a powerful answer to cruelty, not revenge alone, but truth, solidarity, and steadfastness. Clara does not defeat Voss because she is stronger than everyone else by herself. She wins because she learns to trust, to be trusted, and to stand with others who choose decency over fear. Everett, Roy, the crew, Pearl, and even the flawed Jesse all become proof that justice grows when people stop facing evil alone. Another moral lesson is the importance of being seen clearly. Clara has spent her life being judged by appearance, by gossip, and by other people's narrow ideas. Everett's first gift to her is not romance but respect. He looks at her face, he listens. He recognizes her mind, her strength, and her humanity. That simple act becomes transformative. The story reminds us that love, in its truest form, begins with recognition, seeing someone honestly and honoring what is there. In the end, this is a story about reclaiming what was stolen, not only land, but identity, belonging, and hope. Its moral is clear. When truth is preserved, when courage keeps walking, and when good people choose to stand together, even the longest road through loss can become the road home.